Hello and welcome to the Critic Show. Tom Jones is absent again this week, so I'm joined by Henry Hill, the political editor, and our special guest this week. We have former Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford, many-time author and peer of the realm, Nigel Biggar. Lord Biggar, welcome to the Critic Show.
Thanks for having me.
The overwhelming reason that, and I think your driving interest at the moment, is the debate around Project Spire and the Church of England's policy or consideration around reparations for transatlantic slavery, and it's quite a complicated backstory because it's not that they're alleging that the church was specifically involved with the trade itself, but it's to do with a fund or a pot of money that was allocated for poor clergy. Is that right?
That's right. So in the early 18th century, there was a fund called the Queen Anne's Bounty, whose reason for living was to support poorer clergy in parishes. The original claim made was that this bounty invested in the South Sea Company, and in particular in shares, and that the company was involved in slave trading. Therefore, the church profited from slave trading. That's the argument.
Is the existence of this fund and its link to the slave trade, had that been widely known and remarked upon in earlier times, or do you think that was something that was dug up post hoc after the concept of reparations in a broader context, looking nationally, where at certain companies had been knocking around sort of for a few years, and the Church of England, do you think they just decided to get in on the action in a trendy subject?
They got on the action a little earlier than I thought, because a lot of obsession about race and slavery happened after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020. In fact, the church commissioned this research in 2019. Quite what provoked it to do that then, I don't know, but I suppose maybe they saw a trend developing and decided to get ahead of the game. I take it that this is speculation. I think the stimulus was that the church wanted to apologize to black people for giving them a cold shoulder when, for example, they came to the West Indies to England in the 1950s and 60s. I also speculate that the church wanted to show some kind of national leadership, since on the gay issue it is not progressive. It won't bless gay marriages. So it wanted to show itself to be progressive on another front. That's my speculation as to the motive.
Do you think that it was driven primarily more by this sort of search for relevance in the modern world, or do you think it was driven by internal politics within the Church of England, either within the church specifically in England or the Anglican communion more broadly, looking at the African churches? And obviously there's politics going on there,
yes, of course,
again to do with, but that's more with the Africans being opposed to social progressivism. How do you think that this played in to their settling on?
I'm not aware of any lobbying on the part of Anglican churches in Africa for reparations. If there were, it would be ludicrous, given the extent to which Africans themselves were involved in slave trading long before Europeans and the British arrived. Possibly there was lobbying from Anglican churches in the Caribbean, because the CARICOM, the community of 15 Caribbean nations, has been lobbying for reparations since about 2013, 14, 15. But I'm not aware of major external pressure. I suspect it was internal. Someone told me that Justin Welby, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, this was a special project of his that he promoted. Quite why he did that, I don't know.
It's interesting to see and it does appear to be within, and actually I don't know to the extent to which it's true, this is just my suspicion as an outsider. It seems to be a particular generational cohort within the church among whom this idea has become popular. The cohort that I suppose came of age, rose through the ranks in the early 1970s, or perhaps the mid 1970s, and then achieved senior positions in the late 1990s. Yes. Is it that generation in particular, or is it actually even more popular among younger cohorts?
It's certainly that generation, and of course that generation is in charge of most of our educational and cultural institutions. So it's not peculiar to the church, and the irony is, although the church, I think, is trying to show leadership here, actually, it's following a widespread trend. So what's peculiar about this generation of people who are now in charge of our institutions, including the Church of England? I suspect decades of being told and absorbing the idea that the West is responsible for the sins of the world, that the British Empire was a bad thing, a peculiar susceptibility to the American-inspired Black Lives Matter movement's claim that we are systemically racist. Plus the fact that Christians do think that asking forgiveness is a good thing to do, which it is when you've got something for which you're guilty.
Yes. How sincere do you think that this is among those people? Is it motivated by a genuine guilt at, I don't know, the relative comfort of their own lives compared with others in the world today, or perhaps people generations past? Or do you think it's more cynical? Is it about shoring up their own authority?
I'm sure it's motivated by a variety of motives. I'm sure that some are quite sincere. I'm also sure that some of the church commissioners have reservations about this policy, but felt that they couldn't speak up against it. And particularly if you're a white male, to object to a policy that is premised on white guilt and is designed to atone for the sins against black people, it puts you on your back foot, especially if there's a risk that someone will turn around and say to you, as a white male, you have no moral standing. So I'm quite sure there are people among the church commissioners, and it is the church commissioners who are responsible for this policy. I think there are about 26 or 28 of them, including both Archbishops of Canterbury. I'm quite sure that there was a variety of views.
How would those 28, sorry, just in the crudest demographic terms, I assume that the majority of those 28 are themselves white men. Or is that, yeah?
Yes, they are. I'm not sure as to gender,
Yeah.
but a majority will be white.
Yeah, and it sort of sounds like some of the institutional politics that we've seen in, well, definitely in academia, but in other walks of life, but certainly in certain boardrooms, apparently. But where you've got a room dominated by white men who are all trying to compete with one another to be
Yes.
to counter signal their own personal demography.
Yes, and I think there appears to be a terror of being called racist. Since I've been called racist and survived, I'm positively as to why people are so terrified of it. But I guess in certain circles it loses you friends and might even cost you professionally. But also the other thing is, of course, most people know very little about history. Most people know very little about imperial history. Most people know about slavery only from what they've read in the newspapers, and probably if they're in the Church of England, they will read the Guardian, not the Telegraph. Or
the Critic.
Perhaps the Critic. But so a lot of this, these ideas about white guilt, about the notion that British involvement in slavery was extraordinary, which is why we in particular have to atone for that sin. It's based on ignorance.
And obviously, I think, and you've touched on this in what you've written for us, that there is this particular focus that so many of these people, when they think about slavery, the only model of it that they can conceptualize is transatlantic chattel slavery and the triangle in those specific centuries, sort of between the 16th and 19th centuries. And of course, it's not that slavery is a far more enduring and far more widespread phenomenon across human history. But obviously, major elements of it in Africa, in Islamic history, North Africa, East Africa, is always there.
Yeah. So one of the most striking features of the reparations case is the exclusive focus on the white enslavement of black people, and that requires justification because, as you say, slavery was a universal institution practiced since the dawn of history in every continent by people of every skin color. Yes, it's true that over 150 years, some British people, not all, not most, some British people were involved in slave trading and profiting from slavery. It's reckoned that the British shipped across the Atlantic over that century and a half or so, 3.328
Mhm.
million,
Million.
out of a total of 12.75 million shipped by Europeans. So it's about a quarter of the European total. Now, that's a lot of people. But let's put it in perspective. In around 1850, the African Fulani people, who were Muslim, I think, ran vast slave plantations in what's now northern Nigeria. And at that time,
Mhm.
they employed 4 million in one time, which was equivalent to the total number of slaves in the American South at that time. And Martin Plaut, who was actually a man of the left, who's a long-time Labour Party member, has just published a book called Unbroken Chains, 5,000 Years of African Slavery. He guesstimates a total of Africans enslaved and traded across the Atlantic, up to the Mediterranean, and across the Indian Ocean, as far as Japan.
Good Lord.
Yeah, at over 40 million. I mean, over a long period of time. So put in that context, 3.25 million British transported slaves over 150 years is not so extraordinary. So why pick on the Brits?
One theory, of course, why we, but particularly not necessarily on the Brits, but looking at transatlantic slavery to the Americas, was of course that you have many millions of the descendants of those people alive today, and they're obviously a hugely important part of American politics, American culture, but also across Latin America. Other forms of slavery, you don't see the legacy of it. I mean, for example, I remember years ago when I was a diplomat in Iraq, I met an Iraqi general. He was a general. No, he was a lieutenant colonel, but he was black. And I was astonished by this. I said to my Iraqi colleagues, I said, I've never met a black Iraqi before. I said, well, yes, down in Basra, there was a lot of slavery over many years. It was a constant thing coming from East Africa. And I said, well, in that case, I'm surprised you don't see more black people. And he said, well, generally when they arrived, they were castrated. So, of course, you don't see the descendants because, of course, they weren't.
Oman, it's a fascinating country, but when I was there last year, I hadn't realized that actually Oman only really got rid of slavery in the early 1970s, when the British helped Sultan Qaboos overthrow his father.
Yeah.
Because his father, it was extraordinary. It was one of the most backwards countries on earth for all kinds of reasons. But and earlier than that, and even in the 1920s and 30s, there was an endemic problem of black African pilgrims to Mecca being basically conned onto ships by slave traders on the basis that they were going to go to Mecca and then being absconded. So actually the East African slave trade, which was flowing through the Middle East, endured an awful lot longer, like a century longer or two, than the one in West Africa. And yet that doesn't really play any role in people's popular imagination of the slave trade, and nor, as we've mentioned, is the fact that I remember when I was at school, we watched Roots, this very famous film.
Yes.
And the thing that strikes me is that right at the beginning, the way that Roots starts is that the main character is in Africa, and white men with nets come off a ship and catch him. And I'm not sure if that happened once in the entire history of the slave trade, because actually what it was is that we were trading them. And there's this wonderful letter from one of the West African potentates at the time, who is saying, I am Queen Victoria's loyal vassal, and I will defer to her in all things except abolishing slavery, which is why the British had to use force. And again, none of this is ever accounted for in whatever calculations are used to come up with this.
So in Roots, you have white men coming with nets to catch Africans.
Yes.
Well, that wasn't, if that ever happened, that certainly wasn't usual, because what usually happened was Africans enslaved other Africans, brought them to the coast. Well, Europeans did not go.
No, exactly. But I think it's interesting that when they made this very seminally famous film about slavery and the black African-American experience, they felt the need to put that on it.
And there were cases of people being caught like that by other Africans, but generally speaking, it was classes of people that were already in some form of penury or bondage to other for either as part of a primitive class system, or or through debt obligations, or through having been captured in conflict. But there was an endemic and remains an endemic culture of what we would regard as domestic slavery. And one place I've certainly seen it absolutely today is Mauritania, where it's absolutely there.
Yes.
I think it was formally abolished in 2007.
But there's still it's an absolutely normal for an Arab family there to have a black African person, another family living with them, and that is multi-generational, and that's considered absolutely. People don't think of it as slavery. That's just.
You mentioned domestic slavery. You also mentioned castrations. Let me just make a point about that, because one claim made is regardless of the numbers, the chattel slavery in the West Indies and in the American South was the most inhumane, the most brutal. That's another reason why we should focus on this in particular. And I've thought about that, and well, first of all, let's be clear. Yes, sometimes the plantations in the West Indies were atrociously brutal, not universally so. I mean, there were variations in terms of humanity, but even so, even if being worked to death on plantations was very, very bad indeed. Meanwhile, in 1860, in the Sudan, according to one French witness, every year the Sudan furnished the Arab slave trade with 35,000 African boys aged between 6 and 12 to be prepared to serve as eunuchs. But 35,000 African prepubescent boys produced only 3,800 eunuchs. What happened to the rest? They died in the process. So it's really not clear to me that Caribbean chattel slavery was uniquely awful. All sorts of other forms of slavery were very awful, not least being a galley slave of the Mediterranean.
And that was it was a fairly common. We think of the Barbary slave. What was the name of the town? There was a village in Ireland that was just found one day. The post office had turned up, and it was in Baltimore.
Yes, it was, and County Cork.
And it was just found abandoned, and they assumed that the only possible explanation was Barbary corsairs.
There was also a village in Cornwall. Same thing happened.
Was there really?
Yeah.
And of course, there's very little evidence today in terms of people alive who could presumably these people simply didn't say. It wasn't that they were transplanted somewhere and resettled as a workforce. They were just.
Who knows what happened to them? Yeah.
And I suppose if you're looking at that scale, you're probably not going to be ending up with sort of population that would produce a stable. Because people, I do think people forget completely the fact that there was slave raiding on the coast of these islands by Barbary corsairs. But in order to end up with a stable, enduring population of the sort that you've got in the United States or Brazil, the other one that people sort of forget when it comes to major African slaving nations, you do need to be taking large numbers of them over there and then having the population able to sort of sustainably breed, which probably wouldn't have been the case with the Barbary corsairs. But one of the things that's always struck me about the case for reparations is that if you're an African American, what's the basis for the comparator? Is it that you are disadvantaged relative to white Americans? Well, absent the slave trade, you wouldn't be in America. So why is white America your comparator? Or is it that you're disadvantaged versus people in West Africa today? Well, I don't think on any metric that's actually true. And so when we talk about obviously slavery was an absolutely terrible.
The median African American is wealthier than the median British.
So I think this is the interesting thing about the intergenerational bit, right? Which is that slavery was absolutely an evil and terrible thing done to the people to whom it was done. And a lot of the people in subsequent generations, had to endure Jim Crow and all kinds of other horrors that were horrors in their own terms. But if you're somebody today, I don't see what the argument is that you personally have been traumatized and disadvantaged by slavery, unless of course you're one of like that woman who demanded reparations the other day, you're descended from an African royal family that traded in slaves.
That's the end of the free section of the Critic Show, but the conversation goes on. If you'd like to hear the full episode, subscribe at outpoststudios.net.